CGTN, China Global Television Network.
It's been hailed as a new beginning for Sudan. The Transitional Government in Khartoum and the main rebel alliance have finally signed a peace deal to kick off an end to 17 years of armed conflict. Following months of negotiation in the South Sudanese capital, Juba, the deal seeks to end violence in the hotspot regions of Darfur, South Kordofan and the Blue Nile states. However, previous peace accords in 2006 and 2011 failed to break contentious deadlocks. And now this latest deal promises more independence, power compensation and reintegration, which have been the main issues of dispute in the decades-long conflict. So, will Sudan's latest peace deal hold? And what will be the implications for the people in a region long ravaged by war? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, a final peace agreement is scheduled to be signed on the 2nd of October in Juba, South Sudan. But the initial agreements are already being received with much optimism in both Sudan and South Sudan. Patrick Oyet is in Juba and filed this report.
The agreement is between Sudan's new government and an alliance of 9 rebel groups from the western region of Darfur, South Kordofan and Blue Nile. The deal includes a security arrangement that dictates that opposition forces be integrated into Sudan's armed forces. The peace agreement gives more powers to state and local governments. It also provides for a transitional justice and a return of people who fled their homes due to war and reparation.
This peace agreement covers the political situation and security arrangements in the whole of Sudan, and also the economic situation. Full development will only be realized in our country by this comprehensive peace agreement.
The rebel forces have been fighting against what they say was economic and political marginalization by the government of former President Omar al-Bashir. The opposition forces are largely from the non-Arab minority groups. Peace talks have been going on in South Sudan for a year.
I would like to express my appreciation to the parties for accepting the call for a just and peaceful settlement of the conflict through political dialogue, and for accepting our offer for mediation.
The United Nations says about 300,000 people have been killed in Darfur since rebels took up arms there in 2003. Sudan's transitional government says it is committed to ending violence in the country. Previous peace deals fell through, and some analysts say the implementation of the current agreement could also be a challenge. South Sudan's government is urging support for Sudan's peace deal implementation from the international community, and so far, the United Nations says it is behind the process. The Sudanese conflict was complex, with many opponents fighting each other and their main rival, the Khartoum government. However, many of the former warring parties now say that's behind them, and the deal is giving hope to many that it's possible to achieve lasting peace in the region. Patrick Oyet, CGTN, Juba, South Sudan.
And to bring us up to speed with the latest developments in Sudan's pursuit for lasting peace, in Nairobi, I'm joined by Dr. Hassan Khaneje. He's the director of the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies. Maslov Andre is joining us from Moscow. He is the director for the Center of African Studies at the Higher School of Economics. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the program. Now, the developments in Sudan have been described as historic, a new dawn for Sudan. Dr. Haneje, Sudan's main rebel alliance has agreed on a peace deal with the transitional government in a move that many have described as historic. How historic is this and why is it so?
I think this move is historic in the sense that, number one, this is a peace process that is entirely organic and locally led, as opposed to previous processes that have been largely been guided by external powers or external partners. And so it promises, it holds a lot of promise with regard to durability and sustainability of it, because it was made largely by the Sudanese people themselves, of course, under the auspices of the South Sudan in Juba. And so compared to the previous arrangements and interventions, I think in the history of peacemaking generally, it's only when parties themselves take the lead in the process that actually or only then can you be able to achieve a sustainable and durable peace. And I think that is why a lot of people are hopeful that this time around the current peace deal is going to stick.
Talk to us about that hope, Dr. Haneje, that this time around the peace is going to prevail, because it is not the first peace agreement that has been signed in Sudan. Where is that optimism coming from that this time around it's going to be different?
Firstly, the previous attempts, for instance, have not entirely been accommodating. There are some rebel groups or coalition of them which were actually left out, or they simply resisted, joining part of it. There were a number of things that need to be included when it comes to integration, when it comes to refugees, when it comes to addressing some of the historical injustices that are normally necessary for a country that is coming from conflict to heal, that were never addressed. And so this current peace deal promises to address a comprehensive range of issues that are actually a lot of parties that were reluctant to support the process previously. Right now, they're finding that they're finding a reason to be able to support this current peace deal, because a number of their questions have been answered, at least largely.
Maslov, let me get your thoughts on that ripe moment in Sudan, because the negotiations began soon after the ouster of former leader Omar al-Bashir. Did that ouster of the former leader play a major role in the politics of Sudan as we know today, and in the politics of the Sudan prior to the beginning of the peace negotiations in Sudan?
Definitely, there is some link. There is a link between these events, but honestly, I don't want to overestimate the role of ousting of Mr. Bashir as a president of Sudan. The UN sanctions still exist, and even more, the US sanctions affect the Sudanese government even now, after the ousting of President Bashir, which was peaceful and which was not an outcome of any civil conflict. It was an internal matter of Sudan, basically. The decision to remove him, and there were no civil conflict behind this decision to change the leadership in Sudan. So now it depends on how the international community, how it will react on this development.
Right.
In Sudan did not lead to any mass victims and any civil conflict in the country. So this is very important to understand, that this was the peaceful development. Now, what is important now is that this peace process is the investment process. So the government needs to invest money into this, to reintegration of the former militants to the regular military. The government needs to invest money in the military itself, for them not to feel themselves excluded from the process as well. And they need the international sanctions to be removed from the country, and the government institutions to be stronger to maintain this process. Because the government institutions are the first ones responsible for the success of this story. So if the ousting of Mr. Bashir somehow facilitated the process of negotiation between the government and rebels, it means it worked. But this conflict in Sudan is an internal conflict. It's not something introduced from the outside, and the solution is also should be internal, I believe. So the role of international community is to maintain the process financially and open up opportunities for the Sudanese economy to participate in the global trade, especially now in the circumstances of economic downfall.
Let me explore the economic aspect of it and come to you, Dr. Khaneja, because you talked about this whole question of marginalization as having been a major factor in prolonging the war in Sudan. Now, politically, though, the agreement itself contains a timeline that, if implemented, could bring the rebels into the mainstream government. We have seen a similar situation happening in South Sudan, but that hasn't really stopped the crisis in South Sudan. Is this adequate, though, to bring peace to Sudan?
Thanks a lot. What happens in peace agreements is the enforceability. If a peace agreement is going to be durable, there have to be mechanisms to ensure it's being enforced. Now, those mechanisms both come from internally, regionally, and internationally. Now, for instance, in the case of Sudan, as my colleague from Moscow has mentioned, it is important we remove Sudan from a pariah status, because the current environment cannot allow it to be able to reconstruct and rebuild its economy. And without ability to put food on the table for most Sudanese, then it's going to be increasingly difficult to even actualize the kind of peace deal that's being envisioned, because it involves sharing of resources. It involves being able to address certain injustices, which requires money, which requires investment. So in the absence of that, you cannot possibly move ahead. Secondly, Sudan and South Sudan are not exactly synonyms. They're actually, very different. South Sudan is a fairly new country, and it was, I would call, a political experiment, which, of course, we didn't exactly get it right from the beginning. And people who are keen observers of South Sudanese even constitution itself from 2011, we knew it had issues that were contradictory, that were going to bring problems. But I think what is critical is the partners who are going to work with Sudan and the main parties in this process. If both local, regional, and international partners support this with sufficient carrots and sticks, then this peace deal is going to stick. Then we're going to see a transition and a more peaceful Sudan. But if, for instance, the region and the parties and the international community take their eyes off that and do not realize the responsibility that befalls on them in supporting this arrangement to make sure it sticks, then it's going to be increasingly difficult. And so it is one thing to support a peace deal and a peace process, but it's another thing to actually follow through with certain resources that are going to be needed, but also potential sanctions, especially for those people who want to get out of an arrangement, because they're always going to be spoilers. Some of the spoilers are local, some of the spoilers could be regional, some of the spoilers could be international.
All right, gentlemen, stay with us for the moment. We'll continue this discussion in a moment. For now, we are going to take a short break, but we'll continue with the analysis on Sudan's road to lasting peace. Stay with us.
Life moves pretty fast. Ideas move at the speed of sound. Technology moves at the speed of light. If you don't filter out the noise, you might miss the details. We pay attention to the details because they matter, showing you a different perspective. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, the developments in Sudan are being observed from across the region with much anticipation. Earlier, our correspondent spoke to Shuit Voldemichael, a senior researcher at the International Institute for Security Studies, for her assessment of the situation. Let's listen in to that interview.
Thank you for having me on this show. As you mentioned, a number of peace accords failed to achieve sustainable peace in Sudan. They failed mainly because of three reasons. First is that these agreements were rejected by a number of armed groups. For instance, the 2006 Darfur Peace Agreement was rejected by the Sudan Liberation Movement led by Abdul Wahid al-Noor and the Justice and Equality Movement on the grounds that it did not address the root causes of the conflict. In 2011, the Doha Document for Peace in Darfur saw a number of groups under the Liberation and Justice Movement join the government, but this agreement was again rejected by major rebel groups, including the Justice and Equality Movement, the Sudan Liberation Movement led by Mini Minawi, and the Sudan Liberation Movement led by Abdul Wahid al-Noor. The peace processes failed in the past is because the government failed to honor these agreements. For instance, provisions of the 2005 Comprehensive Peace Agreement calling for popular consultations intended to give South Kordofan and Blue Nile their say on how they want to be governed were never completed. There were other framework agreements for peace signed, for instance, in 2011 with the Sudan People's Liberation Movement North, and in 2016 another roadmap was signed with some members of the SRF under the two-track process for Darfur and the two regions. The agreement committed parties to an inclusive dialogue and outlined the agenda for future negotiations, but the roadmap was never implemented. The third reason peace processes failed in the past is because conflict did not end with the signing of the agreements. For instance, the 2006 peace agreement signed by the Sudan Liberation Movement led by Mini Minawi collapsed in 2010 following a series of clashes with the government forces. And in 2010, the Doha Agreement signed between the Justice and Equality Movement and the government collapsed following the assassination of the armed group's leader, Khalil Ibrahim. Of course, this raises the question of whether the peace agreement signed in August will hold. There are similarities with past failed agreements in that, in addition to continued sporadic fighting, a number of armed groups that have troops on the ground, including SPLM North, led by Abdulaziz al-Hillu, and the Sudan Liberation Movement, led by Abdul Wahid al-Noor from Darfur, have not signed the peace agreement. Therefore, implementing the current peace agreement when there are still armed rebel forces on the ground in Darfur and the two regions will not be easy. On the other hand, though, the circumstance under which the peace process is taking place is very different from the past. The armed groups coalition under the Sudan Revolutionary Front that signed the peace agreement last month have not been negotiating with the government. They have been fighting with. In fact, the Sudan Revolutionary Front are signatories to the Freedom and Change Political Accord of the FFC, the civilian component of the Sovereign Council currently leading Sudan. So armed rebel groups are part of the revolutionary forces that helped bring about political transition in Sudan. This, however, does not mean that implementation of the peace agreement will not face challenges. The current peace deal promises quite a lot. Some of the provisions include power sharing arrangements at the national and state levels to ensure equitable representation of the different regions in Sudanese political space, including in the Sovereign Council, the executive, the Transitional Legislative Council, and quotas for the seat of state governance. It also provides for the security arrangement and integration of armed groups into the Sudanese armed forces. It also provides for a wealth sharing arrangement and focused on giving priority in resource redistribution and restitution.
Well, let's continue with our discussion now. Dr. Hassan Khaneje still with us in Nairobi, and Maslov Andre still joining us there from Moscow. Dr. Khaneje, interestingly though, this talks, the negotiations took place in Juba, mediated by South Sudan. Juba itself has, unresolved issues with Sudan. So what exactly is South Sudan's interest in the conflict in Sudan?
First of all, it's a very interesting irony, especially for South Sudan, a country that would be perceived as struggling to bring peace, and make peace with itself, to be the one actually being the host, and it's almost, we can say, the main mediator of or midwife to this process. Now, South Sudan, if there is any country that has a direct interest in the peace in Sudan, is South Sudan. Number one, most of the oil infrastructure in the whole of the previous, of course, Sudan, were based in the northern part, which is in North Sudan. Now, with the civil war that has decimated most of its results, it has destroyed the economy pretty much of South Sudan. I think it's critically important that there is peace in North Sudan so South Sudan can start re-exporting oil again, to be able to get some finances to its economy. As we speak today, South Sudan's government itself, I think, acknowledged they ran out of foreign reserves. And so, of course, they need money. To make money, they need the economy to be running. And of course, then you need peace in both North Sudan and South Sudan. Number two, South Sudan and North Sudan, they are two siblings of one parent. They came from the same umbilical cord because they came from one country. And so it's in the interest of Sudan, of course, for their northern brothers to be peaceful, because only then can you even achieve peace in South Sudan itself. If North Sudan is not stable, then South Sudan is not going to be stable. But I think, I guess, a final perhaps take on this is South Sudan also want to demonstrate to the rest of the world that it's not just a pariah conflict-prone country, that it actually has some capacity to be able to also bring about peace, not just to its immediate neighbor, but perhaps to the region. And I think this was a massive success for the government in Juba for what they have done so far.
Yeah, Maslov, one of the issues that has come up in the peace agreement, when you talk about reintegration, there is going to be a reintegration of the militias, though, into the Sudan army. How practical is it to bring militia and conventional armies together?
This is all about economy, first of all. And we maintain the idea is that the African solutions for African problems should be found. And, all these rebels, there are social problems, social issues which are to be addressed, the challenges to be addressed. And there is also economic background behind any rebel movement. So all those militiamen, they receive their income somehow, and they feed their people, they maintain their military activities because they have economic activities as well, because they have their own economy. And if their own economy is integrated in the economy of the state, the problem might be solved. The cases which I mentioned, Algeria, for example, and Angola, they were time-taking and money-taking for the government. And which is maybe more important is that they require strong governmental institutions, not international pressure on the government, which eventually weakens the government itself, but international support of the government for the government to adopt the international investment. For example, now we see that the United Arab Emirates, they show readiness to maintain the peace process in Sudan. And in the circumstances we observe in Sudan, this economic support may be very important for the country to succeed in this peace process. Because for now, I've just checked the figures. Sudan economy itself, GDP, in recent 10 years, it didn't change. The economy of South Sudan, it reduced 2 times. While there is an economic growth in Ethiopia, in Kenya, in Uganda, in the whole area of Eastern Africa, is the impressive performance in the economic growth in the last decade. So for these countries, what is important is to join this economic growth of the area. And maybe this is relevant for the South Sudan, is to be the bridge for the Sudan to join the Eastern African cluster of growing economies. So we used to consider Sudan as the transport corridor for the South Sudan. But now the situation may have changed, and now the Indian Ocean is more attractive as the area of economic growth.
All right, it is really early days, but looking ahead, and despite the fact that this agreement is coming at a time when the transitional government, is a hybrid of a military and civilian-led government. Looking ahead, though, what do you see as the expectations in the short term and in the long term?
I think in the short term, the expectation is that in the next 3 years, the transitional government is going to be able to achieve some of the provisions in the agreement and lead to, of course, a different government at the end of 3 years. Now, some of course, as mentioned, the quick things that can be done is expanding this political space to allow accommodation of some of these forces which are supposed to be brought into government. But then at the same time, we expect that the transitional government is going to use this success to convince the international community to open up and restore Sudan into the normal group of nations and into international relations as we know it. Because only then can it successfully be able to undertake this agenda and transition after 3 years into a democratic government. Because in the absence of that, I think it's going to be a challenge. But in the meantime, I think we expect that the transitional government is going to do the basics that it has capacity to do as they try to lobby to be included into the international agenda in terms of trying to rehabilitate Sudan from the kind of mess it has been going through in the last few years.
A very historic moment indeed for Sudan. Well, that's all we have time for this week on the program. Thank you to our guests for their insights. Dr. Hassan Hanenje in Nairobi, the director of the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies. Maslov Andrei in Moscow is the director for the Center of African Studies at the Higher School of Economics. Thank you both, gentlemen, for joining us on the program. Remember to follow the conversation online through our social media handles on Twitter, Facebook and YouTube, displaying on your screens right now. And be sure to catch us again next week on Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, it's goodbye.